The spreadsheet was still open when Tamsin Kozlowski hit the floor. A stack of binders went with her, paper scattering across the grey carpet of the 14th floor accounting office. The sound carried into the hallway. A chair scraped back, heels on tile. Someone calling her name. Then, call someone. Then nothing. Tamsin had been at her desk for 19 hours. Before that, 16. Before that, 14. The quarterly audit for Laurier Group's restaurant division had landed on a Friday, and she had not left the building since Sunday morning. She had missed 2 lunches and eaten a vending machine granola bar somewhere around Tuesday. She knew she was thirsty. She had meant to get water after finishing the Bloor Street accounts. She never finished the Bloor Street accounts. By the time the elevator opened on the 14th floor, half the overnight security team was already in the doorway. Beckett Laurier crossed the threshold without slowing. He had been downstairs in the private boardroom when Sterling had knocked. He had been in the middle of a conversation that did not permit interruptions. He interrupted it anyway. The woman on the floor was slight in the face but generous in form. Built the way women used to be before the world decided that took up too much space. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever it had been pinned into. Someone had already crouched beside her, checking her pulse with unsteady fingers. Beckett saw the color of her skin. Then he saw the IV bruising along her forearm. A small card on her desk said she was scheduled to donate platelets again this Saturday. He crouched beside her himself. Her breathing was there, shallow but there. "Get the car," he said. "Mr. Laurier, we can call." "The car." He said it the way he said most things, quietly, once. The kind of quiet that meant there would not be a second opportunity to make the right choice. He lifted Tamsin Kozlowski himself. She was not light. She was a real, solid woman, and he did not appear to notice. He walked to the elevator with her, and did not wait for anyone to hold the door. She did not wake up on the drive over. She did not wake up when the private clinic on King Street West admitted her without paperwork. She did not wake up when Dr. Chen came in with the first blood work results and spoke in a low voice near the door. Beckett stood against the far wall with his arms folded. He listened. Severe dehydration. Electrolyte levels consistent with someone who had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days. Blood pressure low enough to be concerning. Cortisol levels so elevated that Dr. Chen asked, carefully, whether there were other stressors at home. Will she be all right? The doctor nodded. With fluids and rest, but Mr. Laurier. A pause. She was perhaps 12 hours away from a cardiac event. Beckett did not move. He looked at the woman on the bed. The machines tracked her heartbeat with steady electronic patience. Her chest rose and fell. He had run a criminal empire for 15 years. He had sat at tables with men who considered human life a balance sheet item. He had made decisions that kept him awake, not at all. But he had not been prepared for this particular sensation. The realization that something quiet and essential had very nearly disappeared, and he had been in the same building the entire time. He reached for his phone. Sterling answered on the first ring. Cancel Monday's board session. Of course, and Tuesday. Cancel Tuesday. The Vancouver meeting has been rescheduled twice already. Cancel it. A brief silence. The Harbourfront Gala is Friday evening. The Foundation expects. Move it. There's a press call at noon. All of it. Move all of it. Sterling did not argue. No one in Beckett's orbit argued, not about small things, and not about large ones. Within 10 minutes, a calendar that had taken months to build disappeared without ceremony. Beckett set his phone face down on the chair beside him. He sat with Tamsin Kozlowski through the rest of the night. In the morning, Sterling arrived with the personnel files. Beckett spread them across the clinic's small desk. 7 years of records for one employee, Tamsin Kozlowski, senior accountant, Laurier Group, hired at 24 with a degree from Ryerson, and a reference letter from her previous firm that described her as the most thorough person they had ever had to let go due to budget cuts. The overtime records made no sense on paper. She had worked an average of 61 hours per week for the past 3 years. Weekends regularly, statutory holidays, Canada Day, Thanksgiving, Family Day. The record showed she had formally requested none of the overtime. They were all listed under a single notation that appeared over and over, 2 words that should have alarmed someone much sooner. Voluntarily covered. Beckett called the department heads in. They stood in the second-floor meeting room at Laurier House. The general manager of the restaurant division, the head of facilities, the events coordinator, and Faye Whitmore, head of operations, who had been overseeing accounting among 4 other departments for the past 4 years, and who stood now with her shoulders very straight. "Walk me through the last 3 years of scheduling," Beckett said. The general manager started with figures. Beckett stopped him. "Not numbers, names, who covered what and why." Silence. Then slowly, a picture assembled itself. The events coordinator spoke first, her voice careful. "When the Rosedale renovation went over deadline, we needed someone to rerun all the vendor contracts. It was a weekend. Tamsin stayed. She didn't have to," the head of facilities added. "I asked her as a favor. She said it was fine." When the new POS system failed during the October launch, the general manager said, she rebuilt the reconciliation manually. "Overnight, I didn't find out until I came in Monday, and the reports were sitting on my desk." "She sent them to me too," someone said from the corner. It was Hugh, the senior property manager, who had worked for Laurier Group since before Beckett had inherited it. Hugh rarely spoke at meetings. He spoke now, along with a note about 3 vendors we were being overcharged by. I checked. She was right about all 3. Beckett looked at him. "When was this?" "About 14 months ago." Hugh cleared his throat. "I assumed someone from your office had flagged it." "No one from my office flagged it." The room absorbed that. Beckett turned another page. Sterling had cross-referenced a section from the finance system, a series of internal reports, anomaly flags, vendor reconciliations, filed anonymously through the tip portal. 47 reports over 3 years, each one accurate. Together, they had redirected nearly $2 million back into accounts that had been quietly drained by invoice manipulation. For 3 years, Beckett's empire had been protected by anonymous reports he had credited to his own compliance team. He looked at the file number. The submissions had originated from a single terminal. The terminal registered to Tamsin Kozlowski's workstation. Filed, most of them, between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. No one else spoke. Hugh was the one who broke the quiet in the way that older men sometimes do. Not aggressively, but with a kind of tired certainty. "There is something else you should know, Mr. Laurier." He reached into his jacket pocket. "I found these some time ago and didn't know what to do with them." He set 4 small folded notes on the table. They were written on yellow, sticky paper in compact, careful handwriting. Beckett unfolded the first one. "You haven't eaten since the investor call. There's a sandwich in the second-floor kitchen fridge. It's labeled, 'Do not eat.' This means you. The second, the Davison contract has an indemnity clause on page 14 that works against you. Your lawyer missed it. Read it before Friday. The third, you looked tired last Thursday. The annex property isn't worth losing sleep over. It'll close. The fourth simply said, 'Drink some water today, please.'" Beckett sat very still. "Where did you find these?" he asked. "Under your office door," Hugh said. "Various mornings over the past 2 years. I assumed they were from Sterling." Beckett looked at Sterling. Sterling shook his head slowly. "Not from me. The sandwich was real. He had eaten it. The Davison clause was real. He had caught it the morning of, had assumed his own instinct had snagged it. The annex property had closed in 11 days, exactly as the note predicted. For 2 years, someone had been slipping intelligence and groceries under his office door before 6 in the morning, before the building filled, before anyone might see. He thought about the woman on the clinic bed 14 hours ago, the IV bruising, the vending machine receipt in the bin beside her desk, dated 4 days prior. 1 granola bar, 1 bottle of water, 1 pack of crackers. She had remembered to feed him. She had forgotten to feed herself. Beckett closed the file, pulled the full employment records for Faye Whitmore's department. Every scheduled deviation, every approved overtime waiver, every request Tamsin Kozlowski submitted versus what was actually actioned. Faye Whitmore's expression did not change, but her hands, clasped on the table in front of her, pressed slightly tighter together. And one more thing. He stood. I want to understand why a senior employee in this company believed that working herself into a medical emergency was a better option than asking for help. No one answered. That was an answer too. The report arrived 2 days later. Beckett read it in the clinic. He had not left. The nursing staff had stopped, suggesting he might want to go home somewhere around the 2nd morning, when it became clear that he would not. The report confirmed what he had suspected and revealed what he had not. Faye Whitmore had not assigned Tamsin the extra work outright. She had been more precise. When a department needed something done after hours, Whitmore would pass the request along with the note. Check if Kozlowski has capacity. Tamsin always said yes. Whitmore knew she would. The pattern had been deliberate and sustained. But beneath the scheduling records was a personnel file flag from 3 years ago. An incident report. Tamsin had submitted a formal request. 2 pages, carefully worded, asking for a reduced travel requirement due to caregiver responsibilities at home. Her mother had suffered a stroke. Tamsin was sending money home to Kitchener every month for home care. She had not asked for sympathy. She had asked for one administrative change. Whitmore had denied it without escalation, without review, and without notifying HR. The denial notice, attached to the file, included a single handwritten line in the margin. Not official. Just a note someone had decided to leave on the record. She should be grateful for what she has. Not everyone would hire her. Beckett read the line twice. Then he set the paper down with great deliberateness. He thought about the image of Tamsin that had been assembling itself over the last 3 days. Not the woman he had assumed he knew from payroll records and departmental performance reports, but the real one. The one who had flagged his vendors at midnight, who had left notes about his sleep under his door, who had rebuilt a failed system over a weekend on them, without being asked and sent the results without her name on them, who had, in the middle of all of it, kept sending money home to her mother in Kitchener and still shown up Monday morning with the kind of smile that made other people feel like things might be fine. She had been carrying an enormous weight. She had carried it completely alone, partly because she did not feel she had the right to put it down. Through the clinic window, the Toronto skyline sat grey and steady in the October light. Beckett reached for his phone. Tamsin woke to a room that smelled like fresh cedar and nothing like her apartment. The light was low and warm. The ceiling was unfamiliar. The blanket was heavier than any blanket she had ever owned. For a long, quiet moment, she simply lay there, waiting for the world to resolve itself into something she recognized. Then the beeping started making sense. Then the IV line. Then the chair beside the bed. Then the man in the chair. Beckett Laurier sat with one ankle crossed over his knee, a folder open across his thigh. His jacket was folded over the arm of a second chair. He was not asleep. He was reading. Tamsin's first instinct was to sit up. Her body declined. Don't. His voice was quiet. He set the folder down. The doctor said slowly, She blinked. Her mouth felt like it had been lined with paper. How long? 3 days. 3 days. She processed that. The Bloor Street accounts. I didn't finish. They're done. He said it the way he said most things, as a fact. Someone else finished them. She looked at her hands. The ivy line ran into the back of her left hand. Her right hand lay open on the blanket. She had the vague, embarrassing memory of reaching for something in the dark and finding fingers, warm ones. She pressed her hand flat against the blanket and said nothing. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Fine." He looked at her. It was the kind of look that had caused considerably more formidable people than Tamsin to reconsider their answers. "Tired," she admitted, thirsty. He reached for the water glass on the table beside him, already there, already full, and held it out. She took it with both hands and drank. "Tamsin." She looked up at the sound of her name in his voice. He did not use first names, as a rule. She had worked for Laurier Group for 7 years, and she was fairly certain she had never heard him say hers. "You collapsed after working 4 consecutive days without proper rest or food. The emergency physician told me your electrolytes were critically low, that another 12 hours of the same conditions." He stopped, that it could have been significantly worse. She lowered the glass. Her instinct was to apologize. She recognized it as an instinct and tried to examine it instead. "I'm sorry," she said anyway. Something shifted in his expression. "You just confirmed everything I needed to know." She frowned. "You've been awake for 30 seconds, he said carefully. "You don't know where you are. You're still on an IV. And the first thing you said was that you hadn't finished a spreadsheet. The second was an apology." He looked at her steadily. "You did not ask how you got here. You did not ask who has been sitting in this room for the last 68 hours. You apologized." The room was very quiet. "I caused trouble," she said, which was not quite the same as apologizing, but felt like the same animal. "No," Beckett said. "You worked until your body failed. Those are not the same thing." He paused. "You have been keeping this organization running in ways I didn't know about and wasn't told about. You identified $2 million in exposure through anonymous tip reports. You flagged a contract clause my own legal team missed. You rebuilt a failed system in one night and sent the results without your name on them." He held her gaze. "And I have been sitting in this room for 3 days because you also, at some point, decided to make sure I ate breakfast. And I listened. I just didn't know who I was listening to." Tamsin stared at him. Her face had gone very warm. She looked down at the blanket. "I didn't think anyone noticed," she said quietly. "Nobody did," he said. "That was the problem." A pause settled between them, long enough to be honest. "There's a line in your file," he said, "written by someone who shouldn't have had access to write it." He did not repeat it. "It implies that your position here was a favor to you, rather than an exchange of value." Tamsin's jaw tightened. She knew the line. She had read the denial notice. She had sat with it in the stairwell outside Faye Whitmore's office for about 8 minutes before deciding that the bus fare home was more pressing. "I've kept people like that employed for too long," Beckett said. "That changes." She looked at him. He was not a man who made that kind of statement to soften a moment. He was a man who said things because they were true and because he intended them to remain true. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And strangely, the silence felt comfortable rather than empty. The Laurier Group Winter Gala was held at the Fairmont 3 weeks later. Tamsin almost didn't attend. She had been home under a rest schedule that Beckett had delivered in writing, an actual printed document, a schedule with hard stops, and a note that said non-negotiable in the margin beside Saturday mornings. She had stared at that note for a long time. She had laughed, a little, alone in her kitchen. Frances Laurier, Beckett's mother. who had shown up at the clinic on the second day with tea and the specific energy of a woman who had already decided something, had called 3 times in as many days. "You've been keeping this company running," Francis said on the 3rd call, with the warm authority of someone who said what she meant. "The least it can do is buy you dinner and say so." Tamsin came. She wore a dark green dress that fit her body the way she had always hoped clothes might, and usually didn't. She arrived without fanfare and stood near the bar with sparkling water, watching the room with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. Faye Whitmore arrived 20 minutes later. The dismissal proceedings had been initiated but were not yet complete. For another week, technically, Faye still held her title. She had come to the gala in a dress the color of ice, and the particular posture of someone who had decided the best defense was visible indifference. She found Tamsin near the terrace doors. "Well," she said it with a smile designed to look genuine from a distance, "the woman of the hour." She looked Tamsin up and down in a way that was just barely deniable. "I almost didn't recognize you without the fluorescent lighting." Tamsin held her water glass. "Good evening, Faye. You look well, rested." A pause for emphasis. "Amazing what a few weeks of paid leave will do. Some of us were here, covering the gap you left." Several nearby guests had quieted. Faye's voice was calibrated exactly for that. "I wasn't on leave," Tamsin said evenly. "I was in a medical clinic." "Yes, of course." Faye tilted her head. "Terribly dramatic timing. The audit deadline, the gala preparations. You know, people are asking questions about whether it was quite as serious as." She stepped slightly closer. "Well, you understand." Tamsin felt the familiar compression in her chest. The sense of needing to become smaller, take up less space, ask forgiveness for simply existing in the room. She had felt it for 3 years in this company. Longer than that, in rooms that had nothing to do with work. She straightened her spine. "I understand," she said, "that you're nervous." Faye blinked. "The board review is next Tuesday," Tamsin continued quietly. "I know because I helped compile the documentation. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable tonight, but I'm not going to apologize for being here." Faye's expression tightened. She shifted her weight. A small movement, preparatory, and then, deliberately, she brought her shoulder forward. It was not quite a shove. It was the kind of thing that could be described later as an accident, a brush, a misjudgment of space. Tamsin was still not at full strength. Her heels caught the edge of the terrace threshold, and she went sideways, and the room tilted, and she put out one hand to catch herself. An arm came around her waist. It caught her before she reached the floor. The grip was firm, immediate, completely certain. Not rough, just without doubt. Tamsin opened her eyes. Beckett stood beside her. He had crossed half the ballroom in seconds she had not been watching. His hand was at her waist, and his attention, for one full moment, was entirely on her. "Are you all right?" She nodded. Her heart was going quickly for reasons that were not entirely the near fall. He set her upright with careful precision. His hand stayed at her waist for one additional second. Long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be demonstrative. And then he turned. The room had gone silent in the specific way rooms go silent when everyone has collectively decided not to breathe. "Mrs. Whitmore." Beckett's voice carried without effort. It was the voice he used when he wanted the acoustics of a room to work for him. "You were suggesting, I understand, that a member of this organization may have exaggerated a medical emergency for personal advantage." Faye opened her mouth. "I spoke with Dr. Chen this morning," Beckett continued, "who is prepared to provide the board with a complete clinical record, if that would be clarifying." He let that land. "The record indicates that Miss Kozlowski spent the last quarter managing the equivalent workload of 3 full-time positions, without additional compensation, additional support, or as I've now confirmed, basic administrative consideration when she asked for it. The crowd had grown still, in the way that a lake grows still before weather. This organization asked one person to hold more than anyone should carry. She held it for years without complaint, and we called that reliability. His gaze settled on Faye unhurried. When she finally collapsed under the weight of it, someone in this room suggested it might have been strategy. He paused. That is not a comment I am going to let stand. Not in this building, not in front of these people, not ever. Faye said nothing. Beckett turned back to the room. He was not a man who made speeches. He made the other kind. Quiet declarations that everyone present understood immediately and completely. From this evening forward, Laurier Group operates by a principle we apparently failed to make explicit. The people who hold this organization together will be seen. Not when it is convenient, not after they collapse. He extended his hand to Tamsin. Not the hand of an employer reaching toward an employee. The hand of a man reaching toward someone he had been moving toward for longer than he had realized. Tamsin looked at it for a moment. She was not accustomed to being reached for. She was accustomed to being reaching, for the extra shift, for the late-night report, for other people's problems, for granola bars in vending machines at midnight. Being reached for felt strange and specific and a little frightening. She took his hand. The applause that followed was not polite. It was the applause of people who had been watching someone carry too much for too long and had needed someone else to say it first. The changes at Laurier Group did not happen overnight. They happened over the following 4 months, steadily and without spectacle. Faye Whitmore's tenure ended 8 days after the gala. The board review required very little debate. A new internal structure came with a new title, Director of Compliance and Employee Welfare, which was an unusual combination for a hospitality company, but made complete sense to anyone who understood how much money and how much suffering had accumulated in the gap between what the organization claimed to value and what it actually did. The appointment was Beckett's, and it was not a charity position. The first quarter under the new structure saw a 14% reduction in staff turnover and a measurable increase in audit accuracy. Industry analysts found both figures difficult to explain. People inside the organization did not. Tamsin protested the title, mildly, on 3 separate occasions. "I've never managed a department," she said. "I've managed spreadsheets." "You managed 3 departments simultaneously for 2 years without the title or the pay," Beckett replied. "The paperwork is a formality." She gave him a look she had previously reserved for vendor invoices with suspicious line items. "You know that's not the same thing." "I know." He did not look up from his own desk. They had developed the habit of working in the same room in the late afternoon, which had begun when she was recovering, and had continued beyond recovery by mutual unspoken agreement. "Take the title, Tamsin." She took it. Winter moved into spring. Toronto thawed in the slow, arguable way it always did. 1 warm week followed by 2 cold ones. The city perpetually surprised by the same season it had survived 40 times before. On an evening in late March, Beckett found Tamsin in the 8th floor archive room, reorganizing the physical records from the previous fiscal year into a system she had invented herself. This was not part of her role. She had done it because the existing system was inefficient, and she had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and finally could not stand it anymore. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said, without turning around. "I want to. The current filing method would have caused a 4-day delay if we'd needed to pull the Harborside records in December. This cuts it to a morning." "I know," he said. "I read your memo about it." She did turn around then. "You read the archive memo?" "I read everything you write." He said it simply, the way he said true things, without softening and without apology. I have for some time. I just didn't know it was you. Tamsin set down the folder in her hands. There's something I've been trying to understand, she said carefully. She was not a person who rushed at the center of things. She had learned to approach from the side. People like you, she paused, searched for less clumsy phrasing, didn't find it. You could have anyone. Women who belong at those galas. Who know how to walk into rooms and not wonder whether they're taking up too much space in them. Beckett's expression did not change. He waited. I've spent my whole career trying not to be visible, she said, making myself useful instead, because useful was something I believed I was allowed to be. She looked at him directly, because she was braver than she appeared, and she had been building to this for months. I'm not sure I know how to be chosen, not just useful. Beckett pushed off the doorframe. He crossed the room the way he crossed most spaces, without hurry, without hesitation, as though the room had been arranged for him. He stopped close enough that she could see, for the first time clearly, that he was not entirely comfortable either. He was simply better at not showing it. There was a small exactness to the way he held himself, contained, watchful, that she recognized now as a kind of loneliness she understood from the inside. I noticed you 3 years ago, he said. A note about my coffee intake that I found on a Monday morning and read 4 times, because I couldn't figure out who had written it or why they thought they had the standing to leave it. A pause. I kept it. She stared at him. You reminded me to be a person, he said, when most of the people in my life were only interested in what I could do. You left notes about water and sleep. You flagged a clause in a contract worth more than some small countries, because you thought I should know. You protected the people in this building anonymously, from a workstation at midnight, because it was the right thing and you didn't need credit for it. His voice was quiet and precise and entirely certain. I was not looking for someone who belonged at a gala. I was looking for the person who was writing those notes. I just didn't know to look for her, specifically. Tamsin's throat had gone tight. I'm not, she started. I know what you are, he said, without hesitation. I've read 4 years' worth of documentation. She laughed. It came out surprised and genuine and slightly damp. The kind of laugh that arrives when something releases that has been held too long. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the same precision he brought to most things. Careful, unhurried, as though he had all the time that existed and intended to use it correctly. She leaned into it, slightly, just slightly. You still haven't mentioned the memo, she said. The archive reorganization memo. It's a good system. It's a very good system, he agreed. I already approved it. This time the laugh was less damp and more real. She let it out without apologizing for it. His fingers stayed at her jaw for a moment longer than the gesture required. Neither of them moved away. 6 months later, at the Laurier Foundation's annual impact report, a journalist raised her hand from the 3rd row. Mr. Laurier, you appointed someone with no prior director-level experience to lead a department that didn't previously exist. What convinced you that was the right decision? The room waited. Beckett looked, briefly, toward the front row, where Tamsin sat with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular expression she wore when she was hoping not to be noticed. He had spent most of the past year learning to recognize that expression. He was working, with her reluctant consent, on the project of making it unnecessary. She taught me something that running a company for 15 years hadn't, he said. That the most capable people in any room are often the ones doing the most work without anyone knowing it. And that the worst thing an organization can do, he looked back at the journalist, is let that continue. The applause started slowly and built. Tamsin lowered her head. She pressed her lips together against something that was not quite tears, and not quite a smile, but was made of the same material as both. When Beckett left the podium, He did not stop to speak with the investors who turned toward him or the journalists with their hands half raised. He walked directly to the front row. He sat down beside Tamsin. She looked at him sideways. "You didn't have to say that," she said. "I know." He reached over and opened his hand, palm up, between their chairs. She looked at it. She had spent years reaching for things without being certain she deserved them. Extra shifts, the right to ask for help, the belief that being useful was the same as being valued. She was still learning, with considerable effort and occasional backsliding, that those were not the same thing at all. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, and he did not make anything of it, and neither did she, and somehow that was the whole of it. The two of them sitting in a room full of people, holding on quietly, without explaining themselves to anyone. Later, on the upper floor of Laurier House, with the Toronto skyline spread below them, in the dark, Tamsin rested her head against Beckett's shoulder. "I used to think the most professional thing I could do was make myself invisible," she said. "Do the work and let it speak without me attached to it." And now, his voice was low and even like most things about him. She considered the question properly, the way she considered most things. From multiple angles, with patience, without rushing toward the comfortable answer. "Now I think that was just fear," she said, dressed up in reasonable language. His hand moved over hers. "You were never invisible to me," he said. "You were just anonymous." She turned her head slightly and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and below them the city carried on with its usual business. The Gardener full of taillights, the lake flat and dark beyond the harbour front, the whole enormous machinery of a place that contained, somewhere inside it, two people who had found each other through a series of notes, slipped under a door. Neither of them had planned it that way. It had happened anyway.